When I first met Daniel, I believed in fairy tales, the kind where love could erase every difference, every obstacle. I was naive enough to think that my heart alone could bridge the vast gap between his world and mine. Daniel's family had a history I could barely even name: grand estates, exclusive clubs, endless connections. I came from a small apartment, a middle-class upbringing, and a life where every dollar was earned and every achievement quietly celebrated. I didn't mind the difference. I embraced it, thinking that my love could make up for the worlds that separated us. In the beginning, Daniel was attentive, affectionate, and patient, and I ignored the subtle hints that his family didn't quite approve. The first time his mother referred to my simple tastes during a dinner, I laughed it off, convincing myself that such comments were trivial. The whispered comparisons between me and some high society friend stung more than I admitted. I worked endlessly to fit in, dressing better, refining my manners, reading the magazines they read, learning the names of their favorite restaurants. Every smile I gave, every polite laugh, felt like armor I wore for acceptance. Yet, beneath all the effort, I slowly realized that no matter how perfect I tried to be, I was always good enough to love privately, but never enough to display publicly. There were moments when I caught Daniel glancing away, perhaps uncomfortable when his friends complimented me too effusively, as if even he couldn't show pride without risking judgment. I began to notice patterns, tiny dismissals, quick corrections, polite but cutting remarks about my upbringing, my family, my ambitions. Still, I told myself that love should be enough. I held on to the hope that our bond, the intimacy we shared behind closed doors, would outweigh the judgments of others. I forgave the slights, smiled through the snide comments, and convinced myself that endurance was part of love. But each dinner, each gathering, left a small bruise, a quiet reminder that I was the outsider, the guest who could never truly belong. I loved him with every fiber of my being. Yet in that love, I began to understand a painful truth. No matter how deeply I gave, no matter how flawlessly I performed, I was never fully seen. I was the perfect wife on the surface, the smiling, accommodating partner. But underneath, I carried the sting of exclusion and the knowledge that my value in his family's eyes was conditional at best. And still, I persisted, believing that one day, love would triumph over their judgment, that one day, I would not just exist in private moments but be celebrated openly. Little did I know that the real test, the reckoning, was yet to come, and that the lessons of being good enough to love privately, but never to display publicly, would shape the path of my ultimate empowerment. The first time I truly felt the divide, I was sitting at the polished dining table of Daniel's parents, surrounded by crystal glasses and the quiet hum of their carefully curated conversation. His mother's voice carried that clipped, practiced tone, the kind that made every word feel measured and deliberate. As the conversation drifted toward his brother's upcoming wedding, I could sense the shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tightening around me. Comments about invitations floated across the table like daggers wrapped in silk. "We need to be selective," his mother said lightly, her eyes glancing at Daniel with a knowing look that excluded me entirely. His brother smirked, leaning back in his chair as if I were invisible, adding remarks about keeping things intimate and exclusive. I smiled politely, nodding at the appropriate moments, careful not to overstep, careful not to betray how the words clawed at me. Every laugh I forced felt heavy. Every, "That sounds lovely," I murmured, was a small act of self-preservation. Inside, my heart sank. The conversation seemed designed to remind me of my place, to assert the unspoken rule that I was tolerated, never embraced. I noticed the fleeting glances exchanged between the men, the subtle tilts of heads, and the careful curation of topics that made sure I was always the outsider. The wine sparkled in my glass, but no warmth reached me. I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself that family dynamics are often awkward, that perhaps I was reading too much into their words. Yet the more I listened, the more I understood. This was deliberate. Their jokes about keeping the guest list elite were not merely humorous. They were boundaries drawn in polite cruelty. I realized then that my effort to belong, my careful adjustments, and my quiet patience had not erased the divide. It was a clear signal. I was not, and never would be, fully part of their circle. And in that realization, Beneath the polite smiles and measured words, a small seed of determination began to take root. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message that made my stomach drop. It was from Daniel. I unlocked it with a faint sense of unease, and there it was. About the wedding. Better if you don't come. It's just family and close friends. I stared at the screen, unable to process the words fully at first. My fingers trembled as I scrolled up to make sure I hadn't misread it. No, it was right there, plain and cruel. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. How could anyone send a message like that as if I were a problem to be politely excused? I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, my heart racing with a mixture of shock and humiliation. I dialed his number, my hands shaking, trying to steady my voice. "Daniel, why would you send that?" I asked, striving for calm, but the quiver in my words betrayed me. His voice on the other end was annoyingly casual, almost detached. "You'll make things awkward. You don't fit that crowd," he said, as though stating a fact rather than shattering my confidence. Those words hit me harder than any argument we'd ever had. It wasn't just that I was being excluded. It was that I was being erased, dismissed as though my presence was a liability to his family's image. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest, a suffocating mix of hurt and anger. Every memory of our marriage flashed in front of me. The nights I stayed up planning events he barely noticed, the quiet sacrifices, the endless patience I had shown to keep peace with his family. And all of it seemed invisible now, as if the years of devotion could be nullified by a single dismissive text. I imagined the wedding without me. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the photographs I wouldn't appear in. I imagined the whispered conversations about how I didn't belong, the polite avoidance of my name, the acknowledgement that I was a stranger in my own life. I wanted to scream, to demand that he see me for who I was, but the words lodged in my throat. The humiliation burned, mixing with a growing resolve I hadn't felt before. I realized in that moment that being canceled like this wasn't just a minor slight, it was a declaration. He, and by extension his family, believed I had no place in their world. And yet, amid the shock and the sting, a seed of determination planted itself deep in my chest, whispering that if they wanted to erase me, they would soon see how powerful invisibility could become when wielded with intention. Once the door to our apartment closed behind me, the dam broke. I sank into the armchair, my phone still clutched in my hand, staring blankly at the wall. The humiliation of Daniel's message replayed endlessly in my mind, each repetition sharper than the last. Questions I had buried for years resurfaced. Was I truly enough? Had all my sacrifices meant nothing? I thought about the nights I had stayed up late, designing spreadsheets and marketing plans for small business ventures I managed quietly, so Daniel could chase his corporate dreams without interruption. I had invested myself entirely in him, in us, in the illusion of a shared future, while he basked in recognition, accolades, and the admiration of everyone around him. I remembered the night I had suggested we invest in hospitality, explaining how small boutique hotels could grow into something substantial, a real family enterprise. Daniel had laughed, brushing it off as a whimsical idea, a fantasy not worth serious consideration. I had smiled politely then, but now that moment replayed with bitter irony. All those quiet hours building plans, taking calculated risks in secret, had laid the foundation for the life I would someday claim as my own. Tears stung my eyes and I gripped the armchair tightly, feeling both rage and despair. How had I allowed myself to be made invisible for so long, to be excluded from my own life, to be dismissed so casually by the man I had trusted most? I paced the apartment, running over the memories of ignored warnings, subtle slights, and daily erasures that had become my reality. And yet, amid the storm of self-doubt and humiliation, a flicker of resolve began to grow. If Daniel thought he could erase me, if he thought that dismissing me could diminish my worth, he had underestimated the quiet strength I had been nurturing all along. Behind closed doors, alone with my thoughts, I realized that this breakdown was not an end. It was the moment when the plan for my true ascent would begin to take shape. Fast forward to the present, and the world had changed in ways Daniel and his family could never have imagined. While they assumed I had quietly settled into the life they dictated, I had been quietly building something extraordinary under my maiden name. Years of careful planning, calculated investments, and relentless dedication had transformed small, overlooked ventures into a thriving hospitality empire. Every late night spent poring over market trends, negotiating deals, and learning the ins and outs of property management had paid off. Mentors I had sought out secretly guided me, sharing insights they would never have offered to someone in Daniel's circle, and I absorbed everything like a sponge, learning the art of discretion and patience. Through rebranding, strategic partnerships, and a refusal to be discouraged by the skepticism of others, I now owned several high-end hotels that catered to the elite, properties that Daniel's family might have admired if they ever acknowledged my potential. The most ironic of all was the luxury resort where his brother's wedding was set to take place, a property under my ownership, though I remained officially invisible. When my assistant reminded me casually of the upcoming event, mentioning the booking and the final preparations, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. It was the perfect stage for subtle, calculated revenge, and I knew I would attend not as the dismissed wife, not as the outsider, but as the host, the one who controlled the very space they believed belonged solely to their family. The thought made my pulse quicken, a mixture of anticipation and calm determination coursing through me. This wasn't about confrontation or spectacle yet. It was about positioning, about claiming the dignity and authority they had tried to deny me. I smiled to myself, considering the irony. The couple preparing for their most celebrated day had no idea that the woman they disregarded for years now held the reins. I began to envision my entry, the subtle acknowledgement of my presence, the whispers that would ripple through the room when it became clear that I was not merely attending. I was orchestrating. For the first time in a long time, I felt entirely in control, empowered not by arrogance, but by years of patience, strategy, and undeniable achievement. The tables were quietly set, and I was ready to take my place, not as a shadow, but as the one who held the power they had never noticed. The weekend of the wedding arrived with all the grandeur Daniel's family had anticipated, and I prepared with deliberate care. I chose an outfit that spoke of understated elegance, a tailored dress in deep navy, simple yet commanding, paired with subtle jewelry that hinted at sophistication without screaming for attention. Every detail, from my perfectly polished shoes to the quiet confidence in my posture, was intentional. I wanted to make an entrance that commanded respect, not spectacle. As I walked through the grand lobby of the resort, the familiar hum of staff activity greeted me, but this time, it felt different. The doorman and concierge looked up and nodded with genuine acknowledgement, addressing me as Ms. Hale, the professional name under which I had built my empire. There was no hesitation in their tone, no uncertainty. They recognized authority, even if Daniel and his family did not. The moment I stepped further into the space, a wave of silent recognition seemed to ripple through the room. Guests glanced up, murmurs floated quietly among attendants, and I could sense the tension building before I even saw them. And then I did. Daniel and his family, standing near the reception area, frozen in shock. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a touch of fear, as if the rules of their carefully controlled world had been rewritten in an instant. I wasn't merely attending the wedding. I was the host, the owner of the venue they had taken for granted, the silent force behind every elegant detail surrounding them. The power dynamic shifted subtly but unmistakably in that instant. I moved with calm composure, my gaze steady, my steps measured, savoring the quiet drama unfolding around me. Every polite greeting I received from staff reinforced the invisible authority I now carried. While Daniel's family struggled to reconcile the woman they had dismissed with the one standing before them in control of everything they prized. In that cinematic, hushed lobby, I felt the thrill of vindication without saying a single word, letting silk and silence do the work that confrontation could never accomplish. For the first time in years, I was not just seen. I was respected, undeniable, and untouchable. And the knowledge of that power radiated through every controlled step I took. Daniel approached me just moments after I had checked in at the resort, his expression taut with disbelief and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice low, yet carrying enough intensity to make me pause. His eyes darted nervously around the lobby, aware that we were in a public space, yet desperate to assert control. I looked at him calmly, every ounce of the composure I had cultivated over years of quiet determination holding me steady. "You never asked who you married," I said evenly, letting the words linger. "You only saw what you wanted." There was a beat of silence, thick and charged, where my voice hung in the air like a verdict. He opened his mouth, likely to argue, to assert some semblance of authority, but nothing came out. Around us, staff members exchanged glances, whispers slipping like currents through the lobby, carrying the realization that the woman he had dismissed was not only present, but in command of everything surrounding them. Guests began to notice the subtle shift, the way the attendants responded promptly to my nod, the way my presence altered the room's energy. Daniel, usually so assured in his family's sphere, looked small and uncertain, suddenly out of place in the environment he thought was his own. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his hands as he grappled with the irony of the situation. His mother, who had long held the reins of pride and judgment, faltered visibly. Her carefully curated composure cracked as the truth settled in. This event, which she had imagined as a testament to her family's status and control, was literally under the guidance and authority of her daughter-in-law. Every polite nod I received from staff, every whispered acknowledgement of my ownership, underscored the inversion of roles. Daniel's attempt to regain control fizzled into impotent frustration, and he realized, too late, that the very dynamics he had counted on were no longer in his favor. The whispers grew, subtle yet unmistakable, spreading among guests like ripples on water. The uninvited guest was, in fact, the host, and the tables had turned so completely that the family patriarchs and social elites could do nothing but watch in stunned silence. I remained serene, letting the poetic irony hang in the air. The power reversal was not loud or aggressive. It was precise, undeniable, and public enough to imprint itself in the minds of everyone present. Daniel's protest faded as he struggled to navigate the new reality, and his mother's once proud smile gave way to a thin-lipped acknowledgement of defeat. In that moment, I realized that years of being overlooked, dismissed, and minimized had culminated in this singular point of empowerment. I was no longer a shadow in their world. I was the force shaping it, and the uninvited had become the unquestioned host, commanding respect simply by existing with calm authority. The reception was in full swing, the room glowing with crystal chandeliers, laughter, and the gentle clink of glasses. Guests were immersed in celebration, unaware of the subtle tension I carried with me, the quiet satisfaction of knowing the power I now held. When the groom rose to give his toast, I could feel the anticipation ripple through me. I waited, watching the room, letting the murmurs of guests and the small glances exchanged between family members settle like a soft drumbeat of suspense. Then, with deliberate calm, I stepped forward. The chatter dimmed as heads turned, curiosity etched on every face. I lifted my glass, addressing the room with a warmth that was both gracious and pointed. "Thank you all for choosing one of our properties for such a beautiful celebration," I said, letting the weight of the words hang just long enough for comprehension to ripple through the crowd. Gasps emerged almost immediately, subtle, scattered but unmistakable. Guests glanced at each other, connecting the dots. The woman they had dismissed, the bride's family's ignored outsider, was the very owner of the venue. I allowed a soft, knowing smile to touch my lips, the kind that carries pride without arrogance. "Hospitality runs in the family," I continued, voice steady, voice clear, though sometimes not everyone notices the quiet ones working behind the scenes. Whispers surged through the room like a gentle tide, curiosity and shock mingling with admiration. Daniel froze, caught between disbelief and humiliation, while his mother's hand flew to her mouth in silent acknowledgement. The subtle authority I projected shifted the room's dynamic in a way that confrontation never could. Guests now saw me not as a sidelined wife, but as a commanding presence, the one who had orchestrated every detail they admired, even unknowingly. In that moment, I felt a mixture of triumph and calm vindication, the satisfaction of turning the tables without raising my voice, of reclaiming not just my dignity, but the recognition of years of careful, unnoticed labor. Every polite nod, every whispered acknowledgement reinforced the reversal of power. I remained poised, letting the truth of my presence resonate naturally. The celebration continued around us, but beneath the laughter and music, a quiet lesson had been delivered. The woman who had once been dismissed was now the quiet force at the heart of the entire event, and no one could overlook her anymore. Daniel's face, once so confident and composed, began to falter. I could see it in the subtle tremor of his jaw, the way his shoulders slumped just slightly, betraying the pride he had always relied upon. The very humiliation he had wielded against me for years was now his, mirrored in every fleeting glance, every hesitation in his movements. He opened his mouth, searching for words, and finally muttered, I didn't mean for this to happen." His apology was rushed, awkward, desperate, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence spoke louder than any words could, a calm assertion of power that left him unmoored in front of our peers. Around us, the staff and guests shifted subtly, their awareness of the reversal palpable even if unspoken. Daniel's attempts to reclaim authority fizzled against the quiet dignity I carried, and the energy of the room made him increasingly aware that he was out of place. He had spent years controlling perceptions, maintaining a facade of superiority, and now that facade was cracking before my serene composure. Every step he took seemed hesitant, measured against the stark contrast of my confidence, and I realized the full weight of poetic justice settling over him. In that moment, I felt no gloating, only a deep, steady satisfaction, the kind that comes from reclaiming agency and allowing the universe to execute the revenge you've earned patiently. He tried to speak again, fumbling through excuses and justifications, but his words fell flat, bouncing harmlessly off the invisible armor I had built over years of endurance and strategy. Daniel's pride, once untouchable, was now dismantled silently, gracefully, and the truth of our reversed positions radiated to everyone present. I maintained my poise, letting the lesson sink in. Power is often quiet, dignity often invisible until recognized, and humility, when enforced by life's circumstances, can be the most profound teacher. The man who had tried to diminish me was undone not by confrontation, but by the stark reality of who I had become. Later that night, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite, the city lights and the glittering resort grounds stretching beneath me, fireworks from the evening celebrations reflected in the glass, bursts of color mirrored by the racing thoughts in my mind. My assistant knocked softly and stepped inside, a quiet smile on her face. "Congratulations," she whispered, her tone full of admiration and excitement. I returned a small, polite smile, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. The victory felt complex, sweet in its justice, yet tinged with loneliness. I had claimed my place, flipped the narrative, and commanded respect in a world that had ignored my worth for years. But in the quiet moments, I felt the weight of what it had taken. I realized that empowerment wasn't about revenge or spectacle. It was about reclaiming my story, stepping into the truth of who I was and the work I had quietly accomplished. Every sleepless night, every ignored suggestion, every whispered slight that I had endured, all of it had led to this moment of calm clarity. I thought of Daniel, his family, and the unspoken understanding that nothing they could say or do would diminish my achievements. Yet my triumph was private, inwardly satisfying, not performative. I let the lights of the city wash over me, breathing in the stillness after a day of upheaval. The world outside continued unaware, moving on with celebrations and chatter, while I savored the quiet authority I had earned. In that solitude, I understood something profound. Power and control weren't always loud, and true victory often came in owning your narrative, shaping your life on your terms, and walking forward with dignity and tact. The fireworks faded, leaving the night calm, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely, irrevocably in my own hands. The next morning, the sunlight streamed gently through the suite, spilling across the polished floors and catching on the crystal vases I had arranged the night before. I placed a single envelope on the kitchen counter, its contents simple yet irrevocable. Divorce papers, final and unambiguous. I wrote nothing more than what needed to be said, a quiet signature of autonomy. "You canceled my invite once. Consider this me canceling yours, from my life." No flourish, no excess, just the truth delivered with precision. I folded the note neatly, letting it sit where he would see it, a final testament to the boundaries I had reclaimed. There was no need for confrontation, no dramatic scene to stage. The words themselves carried their weight. I gathered my things, slipping my belongings into a sleek bag, each motion calm, deliberate, and unhurried. As I stepped out of the suite and into the early morning air, the sun had begun to rise, painting the sky with streaks of gold and soft pink. It felt symbolic, a quiet herald of freedom and rebirth. Every step I took away from the apartment, away from Daniel, was lighter than the last. There was no anger left in my movements, only clarity, resolve, and a deep, simmering satisfaction. The world around me continued to awaken, but I was already moving forward. The weight of years of invisibility lifted. For the first time, I walked unencumbered, knowing I had fully reclaimed my life, my voice, and my dignity, leaving behind only the echoes of a chapter that no longer belonged to me. Months later, I sat in my office, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, glinting off the polished surfaces of my latest hotel acquisition. The phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, and finally, I allowed myself a moment to glance at the headlines. An article about my hotel group's rapid expansion had gone live, capturing the attention of industry insiders and the public alike. The words on the screen made me smile quietly to myself. The media was celebrating what I had built, the empire I had grown in silence while others dismissed me. The reporters' questions had been insightful, and my answers precise. Yet they carried the subtle satisfaction of someone who had endured, observed, and ultimately prevailed. In the closing lines of the piece, my quote was highlighted. Sometimes being left out is the best invitation life gives you, to build your own empire. Reading it, I felt a wave of validation, not for recognition alone, but for the journey it represented, the years of quiet toil, of sacrifice, and of enduring humiliation while nurturing a vision only I could see. I reflected on the path that had brought me here. The dinners where I felt invisible, the cold messages that tried to erase me, the private doubts that threatened to break me. All of it had been necessary. The exclusion, the pain, and the subtle cruelty had forced me to focus, to build, and to emerge stronger, wiser, and unshakably certain of my own worth. Now, the recognition of my accomplishments extended beyond private satisfaction. It resonated publicly, a testament to resilience and strategy. There was poetic justice in seeing those who had once dismissed me unaware of the empire standing behind the name they had scorned. As I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet pride settle in, I realized the true victory wasn't in their shock or humiliation. It was in knowing I had reclaimed my narrative, constructed it with intelligence, patience, and persistence, and emerged not just victorious, but free. Empowered, fulfilled, and entirely in control of my own story, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Life had finally aligned with the vision I had quietly nurtured, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply living your truth and thriving beyond expectation.